The radio crackled with static over the Hindu Kush Mountains, carrying fragments of a desperate transmission that would haunt the airwaves for 13 minutes before falling silent. Lieutenant Commander Marcus Havoc Rodriguez pressed his headset closer, straining to decode the broken words bleeding through the interference. Bravo 7, heavy contact, coordinates, requesting immediate. The transmission cut to white noise, leaving only the hum of his MH-60 Black Hawk's rotors slicing through the thin air at 12,000 feet. What Rodriguez didn't know was that 6 miles below, a Navy SEAL team had walked into a carefully orchestrated ambush in the Korangal Valley. What he couldn't have predicted was that the pilot who would ultimately answer their call wasn't even supposed to be airborne that morning. Captain Zara Ghost Thorne had been grounded for 3 weeks following what her commanding officer termed excessive risk-taking behavior during a medical evacuation in Helmand Province. The official report cited unauthorized deviation from flight protocols. The unofficial whispers in the ready room spoke of a pilot who had flown into a hot landing zone to extract wounded Marines while under direct fire from 3 positions. Thorne sat in the corner of the Bagram Airfield Operations Center, ostensibly reviewing maintenance logs for aircraft she wasn't cleared to fly. Her fingers traced the worn fabric of her flight suit, the one with the faded ghost patch on her right shoulder, a phantom aircraft disappearing into clouds, her squadron's tribute to her uncanny ability to slip through enemy radar undetected. The patch had been stitched by her weapons systems officer before his transfer to Germany, back when her reputation was built on precision rather than insubordination. The base's emergency klaxon pierced the morning calm with its urgent wail. Operations personnel scrambled to their stations as red lights bathed the command center in crimson urgency. Thorne's head snapped up from her paperwork, her pilot's instincts overriding 3 weeks of enforced desk duty. She watched Colonel Harrison stride past her station toward the mission board, his jaw set in the familiar expression that meant American lives hung in the balance. SEAL team in contact, grid November Golf 4721, Harrison announced to the assembled pilots. Heavy resistance, multiple casualties reported. We need birds in the air in 15 minutes. His eyes swept the room, cataloging available aircraft and pilots. They paused on Thorne for exactly 2 seconds, long enough for her to see the calculation behind his gaze, the weight of command that measured rules against lives and sometimes found regulations wanting. Rodriguez stepped forward immediately, his hand already reaching for his helmet. Behind him, 2 other pilots moved toward the board, but Thorne noticed something in their movements, hesitation masked as professionalism. The Korangal Valley had earned its reputation as the most dangerous airspace in Afghanistan. Aircraft went in, but they didn't always come back the same way they went in. The radio squawked again, this time clearer. Any station, this is Bravo 7 actual. We are taking effective fire from multiple positions. We have urgent surgical cases and are running low on ammunition. Request immediate close air support and medical evacuation. Rodriguez was already moving toward the flight line, but Thorne stood from her desk with the fluid motion of someone who had made an irreversible decision. Her boots echoed against the concrete floor as she followed the other pilots outside, where the morning sun painted the flight line in gold and shadow. The familiar weight of her helmet felt right in her hands despite 3 weeks of absence, and she could smell the distinctive mixture of jet fuel and mountain air that meant home to pilots who lived their lives between earth and sky. Captain Zara Thorne's Apache AH-64E Guardian sat at the far end of the flight line, its angular silhouette cutting sharp lines against the pale morning light. The aircraft bore the scars of 47 combat missions, bullet holes patched with fresh metal, stress fractures in the canopy glass spiderwebbed and reinforced, and a collection of small dents that told the story of her unconventional approach to close air support. Her crew chief, Sergeant First Class Miguel Santos, was already performing pre-flight checks with the methodical precision of someone who understood that attention to detail was the difference between bringing pilots home and folding flags. Santos had been Thorne's crew chief for 18 months, long enough to recognize the particular set to her shoulders that meant she was about to ignore direct orders. He'd seen that look before the Helmand incident, and before the Kandahar extraction that had earned her a Bronze Star and a formal reprimand in the same week. "Ma'am," he said without looking up from his checklist, "Colonel Harrison specifically said you weren't cleared for combat ops." Thorne pulled on her flight gloves with deliberate care, each finger settling into worn leather that had molded to her hands over 3 years of combat flying. "Harrison needs every available pilot for this one, Santos. You heard the transmission, seals in contact, heavy resistance. Sometimes the mission takes precedence over paperwork." She began her own walk-around inspection, her hands moving over control surfaces and weapon mounts with the automatic familiarity of muscle memory. The morning briefing had been clear. Weather conditions in the Quarangle were deteriorating rapidly, with cloud cover dropping to dangerous levels and wind shear that would challenge even experienced pilots. The terrain itself was a maze of ridgelines and narrow valleys that offered perfect concealment for enemy positions and precious few escape routes for aircraft under fire. It was exactly the kind of mission that separated competent pilots from exceptional ones, and exactly the kind of mission that Thorne had been prohibited from flying. Rodriguez's Black Hawk lifted off the tarmac with a thunderous roar of twin engines, its medical team already prepared for multiple casualties. Behind him, 2 more helicopters followed in loose formation, a US-60 configured for personnel transport and an US-64 Apache designated as escort. Thorne watched them disappear into the mountain haze, knowing that the SEAL team's chances of survival dropped with every minute that passed without close air support. The radio traffic told the story in fragments. "Taking fire from the north. Can't get a clear shot. Needs smoke on the ridgeline." The voices carried the controlled urgency of professional warriors who understood that panic was a luxury they couldn't afford. But underneath the tactical communications, Thorne could hear something else, the subtle strain that meant the situation was deteriorating faster than the rescue force could respond. Santos finished his pre-flight inspection and stood beside the Apache's nose, his arms crossed and his expression carefully neutral. "If you're going to do this, ma'am, we need to do it right. Full loadout, maximum fuel, and by-the-book radio procedures so Harrison can't claim communications failure." His voice carried the resignation of someone who had learned that following Captain Thorne into impossible situations often produced impossible results. The weapons pylons on Thorne's Apache carried 16 Hellfire missiles, a 30 chain gun with 1,200 rounds of high-explosive ammunition, and 2 pods of 2.75-inch rockets, enough firepower to level a city block or provide precise close air support for troops in contact. She climbed into the front seat of the gunner's position, her hands finding the familiar controls that had become extensions of her own nervous system. The aircraft's targeting systems hummed to life, painting the world in the green phosphorescence of thermal imaging and the stark geometry of heads-up displays. Behind her, Chief Warrant Officer Rebecca Nova Castellano settled into the pilot's seat with the easy confidence of someone who had flown with Thorne through some of the most dangerous airspace in Afghanistan. Nova had been flying helicopters for 12 years, but she'd learned more about combat aviation in 18 months with Thorne than in all her previous assignments combined. Their partnership had evolved into something approaching telepathy, subtle pressure on the controls, minor adjustments in altitude and airspeed that spoke volumes about threats and opportunities without requiring radio communication. The Apache's twin General Electric T700 engines spooled up with a rising whine that Thorne felt in her bones. The familiar vibration that meant tons of metal and technology were preparing to defy gravity through controlled explosions and precisely angled rotor blades. The heads-up display flickered through startup sequences, painting critical information across her field of vision in green text and symbolic overlays. Engine temperature, ammunition count, fuel state, and navigation data merged into a stream of consciousness that experienced pilots absorbed without conscious thought. Tower, this is Guardian 07 requesting immediate takeoff clearance for combat search and rescue mission. Nova's voice carried over the radio with professional calm that masked the tension building in the cockpit. The pause that followed stretched longer than normal, filled with the weight of regulations versus operational necessity. Guardian 07, you are not authorized for combat operations. Return to parking position and shut down immediately. The tower controller's voice carried the bureaucratic authority of someone safely positioned behind bulletproof glass and multiple layers of protective protocol. Thorne keyed her microphone with deliberate precision. Tower, Guardian 07 declaring emergency authority under Article 15 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. American lives are in immediate danger, and we are the closest available asset with appropriate weapon systems. The legal citation was technically accurate. Military commanders could assume emergency authority when American lives were at stake, but it was also career suicide if the mission went wrong. The radio fell silent for 30 seconds before crackling back to life with Colonel Harrison's voice, tight with controlled anger and grudging respect. Guardian 07, you are cleared for takeoff. God help you if you screw this up, Thorne. The transmission ended without the usual acknowledgement protocols, leaving no doubt that her commanding officer was betting his own career on her judgment. The Apache lifted off the tarmac with the measured grace of controlled power, its rotor wash kicking up clouds of dust and debris that painted abstract patterns in the morning sunlight. Thorne felt the familiar sensation of leaving Earth behind, the moment when tons of metal and technology achieved the impossible transformation from ground-bound machine to instrument of flight. The altimeter unwound as they climbed toward the mountains, each 1,000 feet of altitude marking their transition from the relative safety of Bagram Airfield to the deadly uncertainty of combat airspace. The Hindu Kush Mountains stretched ahead of them like broken teeth against the sky, their peaks shrouded in the kind of cloud cover that turned routine navigation into an exercise in controlled desperation. Valleys appeared and disappeared in the mist, creating a landscape where landmarks vanished and GPS coordinates became the only reliable reference points. It was terrain that had swallowed armies for thousands of years, where technology and training faced the ultimate test against geography and determined enemies. Nova adjusted their heading based on the last known coordinates from the SEAL team, her hands moving over the controls with the fluid precision of someone who understood that helicopter flight was less about fighting gravity than about negotiating with it. The Apache responded to her touch like a living thing, its complex systems translating pilot input into precisely controlled motion through three-dimensional space. They flew in tactical formation with the rescue flight ahead of them, maintaining enough separation to avoid mutual interference while staying close enough to provide immediate support. The radio crackled with updates from Rodriguez's flight. Bravo 7, this is Dustoff 36 inbound your position. We're showing heavy cloud cover in your area. Can you mark your position with smoke? The response came back fragmented and urgent. Negative on smoke. Compromises our position, taking effective fire from multiple directions. Need immediate close air support on the ridgeline to our north. Thorne studied the tactical display on her heads-up screen, watching as GPS coordinates resolved into topographical maps that showed the brutal reality of the Korangal Valley. The SEAL team was positioned in a bowl-shaped depression surrounded by higher ground on three sides, perfect terrain for an ambush, with limited escape routes and multiple positions for enemy fighters to maintain sustained fire. The approaching rescue helicopters would be forced to descend into that kill zone, while enemy forces maintained both elevation and concealment advantages. Nova, take us up another 1,000 feet and swing wide to the east. Thorne's voice carried the calm authority of someone who had learned to see tactical situations in three dimensions. We need to identify those firing positions before the medical birds get within range. The Apache banked smoothly to starboard, its engines adjusting power automatically to maintain altitude as they climbed above the cloud layer into brilliant sunlight that painted the mountains in sharp relief. From their elevated position, the valley revealed its secrets in thermal imaging that cut through cloud cover and vegetation to show heat signatures moving among the rocks. Thorne counted at least 6 distinct positions spread across the northern ridgeline, each one carefully positioned to create overlapping fields of fire that would trap any aircraft attempting to land in the valley below. The enemy had chosen their ground well, using natural rock formations and sparse vegetation to create concealed firing positions that would be almost invisible to conventional reconnaissance. The SEAL team's position appeared on her thermal display as a tight cluster of heat signatures pressed against the southern wall of the valley, their defensive perimeter clearly visible as individual soldiers maintained sectors of fire, while medical personnel worked on wounded teammates. Thorne could see the disciplined spacing that marked professional warriors, close enough for mutual support, spread wide enough that a single enemy weapon couldn't engage multiple targets simultaneously. Rodriguez's voice crackled over the radio with growing urgency. Guardian 07, we're getting painted by multiple targeting systems. Looks like they've got man-portable surface-to-air missiles down there. We need immediate suppression of those positions before we can attempt a landing. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. What had started as a rescue mission was evolving into a full-scale air-ground engagement against a well-prepared enemy force. Thorne switched to the Apache's weapons systems, her hands moving over familiar controls that interfaced directly with the aircraft's sophisticated targeting computer. The 13-chain gun responded to her helmet-mounted sight, swiveling smoothly to track wherever she looked, while the heads-up display painted range and ballistic information across her field of vision. 16 Hellfire missiles hung from the aircraft's pylons, each one capable of destroying hardened targets at ranges exceeding 5 miles with precision that could place warheads within inches of designated impact points. Nova, bring us around to a firing position northwest of the valley. We'll engage the northern ridgeline with Hellfires first, then close for gun runs on any surviving positions. Thorne's voice carried the methodical calm of someone who had learned to compartmentalize fear into a resource that sharpened focus rather than paralyzed decision-making. The Apache responded to Nova's control inputs with mechanical precision, banking into a wide circle that would bring them to an attack heading perpendicular to the enemy positions. The targeting computer locked onto the first enemy position with electronic certainty, painting a small box on Thorne's heads-up display that tracked with supernatural steadiness despite the aircraft's movement through turbulent mountain air. Range, 4,200 meters. Wind speed, 15 knots from the southwest. Target elevation, 8,400 feet above sea level. The mathematics of warfare, reduced to numbers and symbols, that would determine whether American servicemen lived or died in the next few minutes. Thorne's finger found the trigger that would send death screaming across the valley at 3 times the speed of sound, but she hesitated for a moment that stretched into eternity. Below them, men who had never met her personally were depending on her judgment, her training, and her willingness to risk everything for strangers who wore the same uniform. The weight of that responsibility had driven her to take risks that earned both medals and reprimands, but it had never driven her to hesitate when lives hung in the balance. The first Hellfire missile departed its pylon with a burst of smoke and flame that painted a white contrail across the morning sky. Thorne watched its flight path through her targeting system, a perfectly straight line that connected her aircraft to an enemy position 4 miles away with mathematical inevitability. The missile's infrared seeker head locked onto its target with electronic certainty, adjusting its flight path with tiny control surfaces that made microscopic corrections at supersonic speeds. The explosion blossomed against the northern ridgeline like an orange flower that briefly painted the mountainside in fire and smoke, before collapsing into a cloud of dust and debris. Secondary explosions rippled through the area as enemy ammunition cooked off in the heat, confirming that the position had been occupied and well supplied. Thorne was already selecting her second target before the sound of the first explosion echoed across the valley, her hands moving over weapons controls with the fluid efficiency of someone who understood that hesitation in combat was measured in body bags. Guardian 07, good hit on the first position. Rodriguez's voice carried obvious relief as enemy fire slackened noticeably. We're seeing multiple secondary explosions. Looks like you hit an ammunition cache. The tactical advantage was shifting as enemy fighters abandoned exposed positions under the threat of precision missiles that could reach them regardless of cover or concealment. The second Hellfire missile tracked straight and true to another enemy position, its warhead converting rock and earth into a momentary sun that illuminated the entire valley in stark relief. Thorne methodically engaged 4 more positions with missiles that struck with the precision of divine judgment, each explosion marking the end of a carefully prepared firing position and the enemy fighters who had occupied it. The northern ridgeline was transforming from a tactical advantage into a smoking wasteland, where survival required constant movement and concealment. Nova brought the Apache into a gun run that would bring them within range of any surviving enemy positions, the aircraft's nose dropping into a shallow dive that aligned the 30 chain gun with targets of opportunity. Thorne's helmet-mounted sight tracked across the ridgeline, searching for heat signatures that indicated enemy movement among the rocks and sparse vegetation. The chain gun responded to her gaze with mechanical precision, its high-explosive rounds designed to penetrate light armor and fortified positions with devastating effectiveness. The enemy's surface-to-air missile positions had been neutralized by the Hellfire strikes, but individual fighters with small arms still posed a threat to the incoming rescue helicopters. Thorne could see muzzle flashes among the rocks as enemy fighters attempted to maintain their ambush despite the devastating airstrikes that had destroyed their prepared positions. The tactical situation required close air support that could distinguish between enemy fighters and friendly forces in terrain, where the margin for error was measured in yards rather than miles. Bravo 7, this is Guardian 07. We've neutralized the primary threat positions. Rescue birds are cleared to approach from the south. Mark your perimeter with infrared strobes so we can distinguish friendlies from enemy in our thermal imaging. Thorne's voice carried the professional calm of someone who understood that the most dangerous part of the mission was just beginning, the delicate balance of providing close air support while rescue helicopters operated in the same airspace. Rodriguez's Black Hawk appeared through the cloud cover like a mechanical angel of mercy, its medical team already prepared for rapid casualty evacuation. The pilot maintained a steep approach angle that minimized exposure time while descending into the valley, where the SEAL team had been fighting for their lives. Thorne watched through her targeting system as medics prepared to sprint from their aircraft to retrieve wounded Americans who had been waiting for help that might never come. The SEAL team's infrared strobes painted their position in thermal imaging with electronic precision, clearly delineating friendly forces from potential enemy fighters in the surrounding terrain. Thorne could see individual team members maintaining security, while medics worked on casualties, their disciplined positioning marking them as professionals who understood that rescue operations were often the most vulnerable moments in any tactical situation. Nova kept the Apache in a tight orbit around the landing zone, maintaining altitude and airspeed that would allow immediate response to any threats while keeping clear of the rescue helicopter's flight paths. The weapons systems remained hot, ready to engage any enemy forces that might reveal themselves during the evacuation. Thorne's finger rested lightly on the chain gun trigger, her targeting system sweeping methodically across potential hiding places, where enemy fighters might wait for an opportunity to engage the rescue aircraft. The first wounded SEAL was loaded onto Rodriguez's helicopter with practiced efficiency that spoke of countless training exercises and real-world experience. Medical personnel worked with calm urgency, their movements economical and precise as they prepared critically injured men for transport to surgical facilities. Each casualty represented someone's son, brother, or father, abstract concepts that became intensely personal when viewed through thermal imaging that showed human forms reduced to heat signatures and vital signs. Enemy fighters emerged from concealment among the rocks, their weapons aimed at the rescue helicopters with desperate determination. Thorne's response was immediate and precise, 30 high-explosive rounds that eliminated threats with clinical efficiency while avoiding any possibility of friendly fire incidents. Each burst from the chain gun was measured in exact amounts, just enough firepower to neutralize enemy positions without creating collateral damage that might endanger the Americans they were protecting. Guardian 07, we've got all casualties loaded and are ready for extraction. Rodriguez's voice carried the controlled relief of someone who had successfully completed the most dangerous part of their mission. Thanks for keeping the bad guys' heads down. Professional work up there. The compliment carried extra weight coming from an experienced pilot who understood the precision required to provide close air support in such confined terrain. The rescue helicopters climbed out of the valley with their precious cargo of wounded Americans, their flight paths carefully coordinated to avoid mutual interference while maintaining maximum distance from any remaining enemy positions. Thorne maintained overwatch until the medical birds cleared the engagement area, her weapon systems tracking methodically across the battlefield to ensure that no threats remained that might endanger the evacuation. Nova banked the Apache toward Bagram Airfield as the mission transitioned from active combat to administrative return flight, but Thorne continued to monitor radio traffic for any indication that additional support might be required. The SEAL team had been extracted successfully, their wounded members en route to medical facilities, where surgical teams waited to save lives that had been measured in minutes just an hour earlier. The flight back to Bagram gave Thorne time to process what had just occurred, a textbook rescue operation that had required split-second decision-making, precise weapons employment, and flawless coordination between multiple aircraft operating in confined airspace. But it had also required her deliberate violation of direct orders, a choice that would certainly result in formal disciplinary action regardless of the mission's successful outcome. Colonel Harrison was waiting on the flight line when the Apache touched down, his expression unreadable in the afternoon sunlight. Thorne climbed out of the gunner's seat with the measured movements of someone who understood that heroic actions and career suicide were often separated by nothing more than successful completion of impossible missions. Her flight suit bore the stains of sweat and stress, but her bearing remained that of a professional military officer who had made difficult choices under impossible circumstances. Santos approached with his post-flight checklist, but his usual mechanical efficiency was tempered by something approaching pride. The Apache had performed flawlessly under combat conditions, its systems responding to pilot input with the reliability that separated advanced military technology from equipment that merely looked impressive in peacetime demonstrations. Every missile had found its target, every system had functioned as designed, and most importantly, every American involved in the mission had returned home alive. Captain Thorne, my office. Now. Harrison's voice carried the weight of command authority, but Thorne detected something else beneath the official disapproval, the grudging respect that experienced military officers reserved for subordinates who achieved results through methods that couldn't be officially sanctioned. The colonel turned and walked toward the operations building without waiting for acknowledgement, leaving Thorne to follow in his wake. The debriefing room was sparse and functional, its walls decorated with maps and tactical displays that reduce the complexity of warfare to colored symbols and grid coordinates. Harrison closed the door with deliberate precision before turning to face Thorne with the expression of someone who had spent 30 years balancing regulations against operational reality. His next words would determine whether her career continued or ended in disgrace. 6 wounded SEALs are alive because you chose to ignore direct orders and launch an unauthorized combat mission, Harrison began, his voice carefully neutral. The official report will note that Captain Thorne demonstrated exceptional airmanship and tactical judgment while providing close air support during a complex rescue operation. The unofficial reality is that you violated my direct orders and placed this command in an impossible position. Thorne stood at attention with the bearing of someone who understood that military careers were built on successful completion of assigned missions, but legendary reputations were forged by choosing to do what was right when regulations conflicted with moral imperatives. Her response would be carefully measured, acknowledging both the technical violation of orders and the ethical necessity of her actions. Sir, I accept full responsibility for violating your direct orders regarding my flight status, Thorne replied with professional precision. However, American servicemen were in immediate danger, and I possess the training, equipment, and tactical position necessary to provide effective support. I would make the same choice again under identical circumstances. Her words carried the quiet conviction of someone who understood that some decisions transcended career considerations. Harrison walked to the window that overlooked the flight line where aircraft prepared for the endless cycle of missions that defined military aviation in a combat zone. His silence stretched for nearly a minute before he spoke again, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had made similar choices earlier in his own career. The SEALs you rescued today included Lieutenant Commander Rodriguez's younger brother. He would have bled out before conventional assets could have reached him. The revelation added personal dimension to tactical decisions that had been made based purely on professional judgment and situational awareness. Thorne had not known the identities of the men she had helped rescue, only that they wore American uniforms and needed immediate assistance from qualified personnel who happened to be in position to provide it. The knowledge that her actions had saved specific individuals, rather than abstract statistics, added weight to choices that had already carried the full measure of moral responsibility. The Medal of Honor was created to recognize actions that go beyond the call of duty, Harrison continued, his gaze still focused on the flight line where helicopters prepared for missions that would carry them into harm's way. But it was never intended to reward insubordination, regardless of how successful the outcome might be. You put me in an impossible position, Captain. Thorne understood the delicate balance that her commanding officer faced, the need to maintain discipline and respect for proper chain of command, while acknowledging that exceptional circumstances sometimes required exceptional responses. Military regulations existed to ensure good order and discipline, but they could never anticipate every situation where human judgment might supersede written procedures. Sir, I request formal court-martial proceedings if my actions warrant disciplinary action, Thorne replied with the dignity of someone who preferred honest consequences to administrative ambiguity. The men I served with deserve to know that military justice applies equally regardless of mission outcomes or personal connections. Her words carried the conviction of someone who understood that accountability was the foundation of military professionalism. Harrison turned from the window with a slight smile that softened the harsh lines around his eyes, the first genuine expression he had shown since the Apache touched down. Captain, you're not going to face court-martial. You're going to face something much worse, a promotion and transfer to a position where your particular talents can be properly utilized. The Pentagon has been looking for experienced combat pilots to train the next generation of helicopter crews. The prospect of leaving combat operations for a training assignment struck Thorne with unexpected force. She had spent 3 years perfecting her skills in the unforgiving environment of Afghanistan, where every mission carried the possibility of contact with enemy forces, and every decision had life-or-death consequences. The transition to peacetime instruction would require adapting hard-won combat experience to classroom environments where theoretical knowledge replaced tactical reality. "Sir, I prefer to remain with my current assignment until the end of my deployment," Thorne responded, her voice carrying the reluctance of someone who understood that combat aviation had become more than a professional specialty. It had become her identity. "My crew and aircraft are familiar with local conditions and operational requirements." Harrison's expression grew serious as he considered her request against the broader requirements of military personnel management and the specific needs of her career development. Combat tours were necessarily limited in duration, both to prevent psychological burnout and to ensure that experienced personnel could share their knowledge with less experienced colleagues through training assignments. "Captain, you've flown 47 combat missions in 18 months without a single aircraft loss or mission failure. Your combat record speaks for itself, but military careers require diversity of experience beyond tactical operations. The training assignment will make you a more complete officer and prepare you for future command responsibilities." His words carried the authority of someone who had successfully navigated similar career transitions. The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the door that brought immediate response from Harrison. Sergeant Santos entered with obvious hesitation, his expression carrying the uncertainty of an enlisted man who had been asked to deliver information to officers engaged in confidential discussion. His presence suggested that operational requirements were superseding administrative considerations. "Sir, we've received priority tasking for immediate medical evacuation in Helmand Province. Multiple casualties from IED strike on convoy. They're requesting Guardian 07 specifically due to the tactical situation and terrain requirements." Santos delivered the information with professional precision, while carefully avoiding any suggestion about how the request should be addressed. Harrison looked at Thorne with the expression of someone who recognized that operational necessity was about to override administrative policy once again. Combat zones operated according to different rules than peacetime assignments, where the immediate requirements of saving American lives took precedence over career development considerations and proper adherence to regulatory procedures. "Captain, it appears that your expertise is required for another mission," Harrison said with resignation that acknowledged the eternal tension between proper military administration and combat effectiveness. "Brief your crew and prepare for immediate departure. We'll continue our previous discussion when you return." His words carried the implicit understanding that some conversations were destined to repeat themselves until circumstances finally aligned with policy requirements. Thorne snapped to attention with renewed energy that spoke of her preference for operational assignments over administrative discussions. The prospect of another combat mission restored the sense of purpose that had been temporarily displaced by considerations of career management and disciplinary procedures. Combat aviation demanded complete focus on immediate tactical requirements that left no room for abstract concerns about future assignments. Santos led the way back to the flight line, where the Apache sat refueled and rearmed, its weapon systems loaded with fresh missiles and ammunition that would enable sustained combat operations if the tactical situation required lethal force. The crew chief had already completed post-flight maintenance checks and pre-flight inspections with the efficiency that marked experienced ground personnel who understood that pilot safety depended on mechanical reliability. Nova was already in the pilot's seat, reviewing approach charts for Helmand Province when Thorne climbed into the gunner's position, her hands automatically finding familiar controls that had become extensions of her nervous system. The targeting computer initialized its complex systems, while engines spooled up with rising whine that marked the transformation from static machine to dynamic weapons platform. Guardian 07 requesting immediate departure clearance for medical evacuation mission. Nova's voice carried over the radio with practiced professionalism that masked any concern about flying into another potentially dangerous tactical situation. The tower response came immediately, clearing them for takeoff with priority routing that would minimize flight time to the casualty collection point. The Apache lifted off Bagram Airfield with mechanical grace that belied the tons of weapons and fuel required to sustain combat operations in hostile territory. Thorne watched the familiar landscape of the Hindu Kush Mountains disappear beneath them as they climbed toward cruising altitude, each 1,000 feet of elevation marking their transition from relative safety to operational uncertainty. The flight to Helmand Province would take 45 minutes across terrain that had been contested by various military forces for thousands of years, where geography and human determination combined to create tactical challenges that tested both equipment and personnel. Modern military technology provided significant advantages over historical conflicts, but the fundamental requirements of courage and professional competence remained unchanged. Radio traffic from the casualty site painted a picture of serious injuries requiring immediate medical evacuation, but without the tactical complexity that had characterized the morning's SEAL rescue mission. The convoy had struck an improvised explosive device while traveling through an area considered relatively secure, resulting in multiple casualties that exceeded the capacity of field medical personnel to treat effectively. Thorne monitored the tactical frequency while Nova navigated through mountain passes that channeled aircraft into predictable flight paths where enemy forces might position surface-to-air missiles or other weapon systems. The terrain itself was both ally and enemy, providing concealment from ground-based threats while creating navigational challenges that demanded constant attention to altitude and airspeed. The convoy's position appeared on their navigation display as they approached the Helmand Province area of operations, a collection of military vehicles positioned in defensive formation around a casualty collection point, where medical personnel worked to stabilize wounded soldiers for transport. Smoke from the IED explosion was still visible as a dark column against the desert sky, marking the site where routine patrol operations had encountered deadly reality. Guardian 07, this is Ground Team Alpha, the radio crackled with the voice of the convoy commander. We have 3 urgent surgical cases and 2 routine medical evacuations. Landing zone is secure, but we're in open terrain with limited defensive positions. Request expedited pickup. The transmission carried the controlled urgency of someone managing multiple casualties while maintaining security for his remaining personnel. Nova established radio contact with the ground team while beginning their approach to the landing zone, her flying skills evident in the smooth reduction of airspeed and altitude that brought the Apache into position for rapid casualty loading. Thorne maintained weapons watch, her targeting systems sweeping the surrounding terrain for any indication of enemy activity that might threaten the evacuation. The landing zone was a cleared area beside the road where the convoy had been traveling when the IED detonated, its sandy surface marked by vehicle tracks and the debris field from the explosion. Medical personnel had established a makeshift aid station, using vehicles for wind protection while they worked to stabilize casualties for transport to surgical facilities. The scene carried the organized chaos that marked professional military medical operations under field conditions. Ground personnel approached the Apache with practiced efficiency, as Nova brought the aircraft to a stable hover above the improvised landing zone, their movements coordinated to minimize exposure time while loading casualties onto the aircraft's external rescue hoist. Each wounded soldier represented someone's family member whose fate now depended on rapid transport to surgical facilities equipped to handle severe trauma injuries. The first casualty was a young soldier whose legs had absorbed the full force of the IED blast, his injuries requiring immediate surgical intervention that exceeded the capabilities of field medical personnel. Medical technicians worked with calm urgency to stabilize him for transport, while maintaining the intravenous lines and monitoring equipment that would keep him alive during the flight to Bagram Airfield. Thorne watched the loading process through her targeting system while maintaining surveillance of the surrounding terrain, her weapons ready to engage any threats that might emerge during the vulnerable evacuation period. The tactical situation remained calm, but combat experience had taught her that enemy forces often waited for rescue operations before revealing their positions and intentions. The second and third casualties were loaded with similar efficiency, their injuries severe but not immediately life-threatening if they received proper surgical treatment within the medical evacuation timeline known as the Golden Hour. Military medical doctrine emphasized rapid transport to qualified surgical facilities as the primary factor in survival rates for serious combat injuries. Nova lifted the Apache away from the landing zone with smooth precision that minimized stress on the wounded soldiers while establishing the flight profile that would deliver them to medical facilities in minimum time. The return flight to Bagram would be conducted at maximum safe airspeed, balancing the need for rapid transport against the medical requirement for stable flight conditions that wouldn't aggravate existing injuries. The radio carried routine traffic from air traffic control as they transitioned through controlled airspace, but Thorne's attention remained focused on the tactical display that showed their progress toward medical facilities, where surgical teams waited to continue the fight for lives that had been temporarily preserved by field medical procedures and rapid transport. Each medical evacuation mission carried the same emotional weight regardless of the tactical circumstances that created the casualties. Soldiers who had been healthy and mission-capable hours earlier now depended on medical technology and surgical skill for survival, their futures reduced to statistical probabilities that measured survival rates against injury severity and treatment timelines. The landing at Bagram Airfield reversed the loading process as medical personnel transferred casualties from the Apache to ground ambulances that would complete their journey to surgical facilities. Thorne watched each wounded soldier disappear into the medical system, knowing that some would recover completely, while others would carry permanent REM.